The moment Arthur McCrae set the bounty money on Sheriff Holly Crane's desk and pushed it back across the scarred oak surface, he knew that the life he had lived for 11 years was finished, and the only question remaining was whether he had the courage to build something worth living for instead. He stood in the doorway of the Redemption Creek Sheriff's office for a long moment, the late afternoon sun of 1882 stretching his shadow long across the dusty floorboards, his hat pulled low, and his jaw set hard the way it always was when he had made up his mind about something that could not be undone. The money was $750, a bounty on the head of one Jesse Plum, a cattle thief who had been found sleeping in a haystack outside of Abilene and dragged in without so much as a single shot fired. It was the easiest collection Arthur had made in years, and somehow that was the thing that broke him. Not the hard ones, not the desperate men who came at him with knives and pistols and old grievances, but the easy one. Jesse Plum had cried the entire journey to Redemption Creek, talking about his mother and his unborn child, and the drought that had taken his cattle in the first place, and Arthur McCrae had listened to every word of it and said nothing. And now he stood in a doorway pushing money back across a desk. Sheriff Crane looked at him the way most men looked at Arthur McCrae, which was carefully and with some amount of unease. Crane was a broad man, red-faced from sun and whiskey, with a silver star pinned slightly crooked to his vest. "You are giving back the collection fee," Crane said, making it a statement and not a question because he was not entirely sure he believed it yet. "I am," Arthur said, "and the prisoner is already in the cell." "He is." Crane looked down at the money and then back up at Arthur. "Son, that is $750. There are men who will never see that much in a single year." "I am aware," Arthur said. "You are just walking away from it. That is the plan." Crane leaned back in his chair, and it creaked under his weight in a way that suggested the chair had strong feelings about the whole arrangement. He picked up the stack of bills and examined them as though they might explain themselves. "This is about Plum, isn't it? The man talked the whole ride here." "He did," Arthur said. "What did he say?" "Nothing I want to repeat." Arthur picked up his hat, which he had set on the edge of the desk out of some old habit of politeness, and put it back on. "There is a woman in this county goes by the name Wilcox, Maude Wilcox. She runs a boarding house about 6 miles east of town near the bend in Cutter's Creek. You know it?" Crane raised an eyebrow. "I know of the Wilcox place. What about it?" "I need to find work," Arthur said. "Real work. I thought I might ride out that way and see if she needs any help around the property." Crane stared at him for a long moment. "Arthur McCrae, best bounty hunter between here and the Colorado border, wants to take up property work at a widow's boarding house. She is a widow. Has been for 3 years. Husband fell off a horse up in the hills and was not found until spring. She has kept that place running on her own ever since, her and her father-in-law, old Clement Wilcox, who is half blind and fully stubborn." Crane set the money down and folded his hands over it. "She is also about the most respected woman in Redemption Creek, so if you ride out there with bad intentions, you will answer to this whole county and not just to me." "I have no bad intentions," Arthur said. "I have no intentions at all. I just need somewhere to point myself." Crane studied him for another long moment and then, apparently deciding that whatever was happening in Arthur McCrae's chest was none of his business, nodded slowly. "You ride east on the main road and turn at the big cottonwood that's been split by lightning. You will see the Wilcox place from there. White fence, red barn, and a garden that shames every other garden in this county." Arthur nodded. He thanked the sheriff in a quiet way and walked out into the afternoon sun of Redemption Creek, Kansas, and stood on the boardwalk for a moment listening to the sound of the town around him. A piano was playing somewhere down the street, a melody he did not recognize. 2 boys were chasing a dog through the gap between the Mercantile and the land office. A woman was hanging laundry from a second-floor window of the hotel, and she sang softly to herself as she worked, and the ordinary beauty of all of it pressed against Arthur McCrae's chest like a hand that was both gentle and insistent. He had been doing this work since he was 22 years old. He was 33 now, and he felt older than that in ways that had nothing to do with his body. He walked to the livery stable, collected his horse, a big dark bay gelding named Soot, and rode east out of Redemption Creek into the wide Kansas afternoon. The land out here was not dramatic. It did not announce itself the way the mountains to the west did, or the canyons further south. It was simply enormous and golden and relentless, grass stretching away in every direction, broken by the occasional dark line of creek willows or the distant smudge of a farmstead. The sky was the kind of blue that seemed too vivid to be entirely honest. Hawks turned slow circles high above, riding the thermals with effortless patience, and Arthur watched them as he rode and thought about patience, and whether he had any left in him of the useful kind. He found the split cottonwood easily enough. It was a grand old tree, or had been, the lightning strike having cracked it down the center so that it now spread in two directions like a man making his case with outstretched arms. He turned south off the road and almost immediately saw the Wilcox property. Sheriff Crane had not exaggerated the garden. Even from a quarter-mile away it was visible, a burst of ordered color against the flat gold of the surrounding land, rows of something green and something purple, and something else that might have been sunflowers standing head-high along the southern fence. The white fence that bordered the property was in good repair, which told him something about the woman who lived here, and the red barn beyond it was solid and well-maintained, which told him a little more. The boarding house itself was a two-story clapboard structure, not large but not small, with a covered porch that wrapped around the front and one side. It looked like a place that had been cared for over a long period of time by someone who understood the relationship between attention and dignity. Arthur McCrae reined Soot in at the gate and sat there for a moment, suddenly aware that he had no particular speech prepared, that he had ridden 6 miles out of town on an impulse that he could only describe as a need to be somewhere other than where he had been, and that he was about to knock on the door of a woman he had never met and ask for work he was not sure he knew how to do. He was still sitting there deliberating when the front door of the boarding house opened and Maude Wilcox stepped out onto the porch. She was not what he expected, though he could not have said what he had expected. She was perhaps 28 or 29, with dark hair pinned up in a practical way that had given up on being tidy somewhere around midday, and she wore a blue work dress with the sleeves rolled to the elbow and a canvas apron that had flour on it and what might have been axle grease on the hem. She shielded her eyes against the afternoon sun with one hand and looked at him with the direct, assessing gaze of a woman who had learned to evaluate strangers quickly and make accurate decisions about them. "You are sitting at my gate," she said. It was not an accusation. It was simply an observation offered in a clear, pleasant voice that carried easily across the yard. "I am," Arthur said. He took off his hat. "My name is Arthur McCrae. I rode out from Redemption Creek. I heard you might need some help around the property." Maude Wilcox put her hand down from her eyes and tilted her head slightly to one side. "Who told you that?" "Sheriff Crane mentioned it." "Hollis Crane sent you out here?" "Not exactly. I asked about the area and he mentioned your place." Arthur turned his hat in his hands, which was a habit he had when he was uncertain, and recognized this about himself with some embarrassment. "I am looking for work. Honest work. I have done some carpentry in the past and I am capable with livestock and I can fix most things that need fixing, given time and the right materials." She studied him from across the yard with that calm, searching gaze. "What kind of work have you been doing?" He met her eyes. "Bounty hunting," he said, because there was no version of this that started well with a lie. She did not flinch, which he noted. "You are Arthur McCrae the bounty hunter," she said slowly. "I have heard that name. Most people in Kansas have, one way or another. You brought in the Danver brothers 2 years ago." "I did. They robbed the bank in Harper. One of the men they shot worked for a friend of mine." She paused. "He lived, but it was close." "I am glad he lived," Arthur said, and he meant it. Maude Wilcox was quiet for a moment, and then she did something unexpected. She walked down the porch steps and across the yard to the gate and opened it without particular drama and stood looking up at him on his horse with her arms loosely at her sides and her expression thoughtful. Up close she had fine lines at the corners of her eyes from squinting into the Kansas sun, and her hands were work roughened, and she smelled faintly of bread dough and something herbal he could not identify, and she was, in a way that had nothing to do with prettiness though she was that too, one of the most composed people he had ever encountered. "What are you leaving behind?" she asked. "When a man like you rides out looking for honest work, it is because something changed." "What changed?" He was quiet for a moment, surprised into honesty by the directness of the question. "I brought in a man today," he said, "Jesse Plum. He stole cattle and he cried for 60 miles and talked about his wife and the child coming in the spring, and I left him in a cell and collected my money and then went back and returned it and walked out." He paused. "I do not know if that makes me a good man or just a tired one, but I could not take that money and ride away as though nothing had happened, and I cannot go back to being what I was." Maude looked at him for a long, measuring moment. Then she stepped back and opened the gate wider. "There is a fence post down on the north side that has been bothering me for 2 weeks," she said. "There are tools in the barn. If you do good work, we can talk about what comes after." Arthur McCrae dismounted and led Soot through the gate, and the gate swung closed behind him with a soft, solid click, and somewhere in the back of his mind, he understood that something had just ended and something else had just begun. The fence post took him the better part of 2 hours, because when he dug it out, he found that 3 of the adjacent posts were also compromised, their bases rotted by moisture and time, and he was not a man who fixed one thing while leaving 3 others waiting to fail. He worked steadily through the late afternoon, aware of the sounds of the house behind him, the opening and closing of the back door, the distant sound of Maude's voice talking to someone inside, the smell of supper beginning to take shape. There was an old man sitting in a rocking chair on the back porch, watching Arthur work with the particular attention of a man who has done that kind of labor himself and has opinions about how it should be done. This, Arthur surmised, was old Clement Wilcox. When Arthur carried the last post to the pile and tamped the dirt firm around the new one, he heard the old man call out from the porch. "You are setting that too shallow," Clement said. Arthur looked at the post. It was set correctly. He had set many fence posts in his life, but he said nothing and drove it down another 2 inches to avoid an argument he did not need on his first day. "Better," Clement called. When he came back to the house to wash his hands at the pump, Maude was standing in the back doorway. "He told you it was wrong, didn't he?" she said. It was not a question. "He did," Arthur said. "Was it?" "No." She smiled, and it was the first real smile she had turned on him, sudden and warm and slightly surprised at itself, and it hit Arthur McCrae in the chest like a warm hand pressed flat against his sternum. "He does that with everyone," she said. "He was a master carpenter for 40 years, and he has never quite gotten over it. Go ahead and wash up. Supper is almost ready, and I have 2 boarders tonight who will eat most of what is on the table if you are not quick about it." He washed up at the pump and came inside. The kitchen was large and warm and organized with a precision that was clearly hard-won. Copper pots hung from a rack near the stove. A large table occupied the center of the room, already set with mismatched but clean crockery. The 2 boarders turned out to be a land surveyor named Amos Purdy, who was small and precise and wore spectacles, and ate with extraordinary speed, and a cattle buyer named Frank Delacroix, who was large and slow and deliberate about everything including his conversation. Clement Wilcox took his seat at the table with the settled authority of a man who had been sitting at that particular spot for many years, and intended to continue doing so regardless of who else showed up. Arthur sat where Maude indicated with a small gesture of her chin and ate supper, and said little, which was generally his way. The food was exceptional: beef stew with root vegetables and cornbread, and preserved peaches from a jar that Maude set on the table without ceremony, and the conversation moved around him in the easy way of people who had shared a table often enough to have their rhythms established. Amos Purdy talked about the land survey he was running along the western quarter, and Frank Delacroix listened and occasionally offered opinions about cattle prices. Clement Wilcox ate steadily and interrupted everyone at irregular intervals with observations that were not always connected to the current topic. Maude moved between the table and the stove with quiet efficiency, and Arthur watched her when he thought she was not looking, and she watched him when she thought he was not watching, and once or twice their eyes met across the table, and she looked away first with that slight, considering expression that he was beginning to recognize as her version of paying close attention. After supper he helped her with the washing up, an offer he made quietly and that she accepted without fuss, directing him to the drying cloths hanging on a nail by the back door. They worked side by side at the basin in near silence for a while, the sounds of the evening coming in through the open window, crickets beginning their conversation in the grass outside, the last birds settling for the night. "You have not told me your terms," Maude said, handing him a dripping pot. "Whatever is fair," he said. "That is not an answer. Room and board and whatever you can spare for wages," he said. "I am not in this for money. I have some savings. What I need is something honest to do with my hands and my time." She turned to look at him directly, her hands still in the wash water. Why would a man who has savings come looking for farm work at a boarding house? "I told you, I need something honest to do. Most men who need honest work do not start a conversation with that word." He was quiet for a moment. "I have done things in 11 years of bounty hunting that I cannot undo. I have brought in men who deserved it and men who were just desperate. I have collected money for both. The work was not always wrong, but somewhere along the way I stopped thinking about the difference, and that is the thing I cannot undo. Jesse Plum just happened to be the one who reminded me." Maude was quiet, looking at him steadily. Then she turned back to the basin. "My late husband Robert was not a bad man," she said, her voice even, "but he was restless. He always needed to be somewhere other than where he was. He went up into those hills because he said the view was something he had to see. He did not come back." She passed him a bowl. "I do not say this to be harsh. I say it because I have learned to think about the difference between a man who needs to be somewhere and a man who has decided to stay somewhere. Do you understand me?" "I think I do," Arthur said. "Good." She handed him the last cup. "The room above the barn is empty. It is small, but it is clean and it has its own stove. You can stay there tonight and we will see how the first week goes. After that, we can talk about whether this is a permanent arrangement." He thanked her. She nodded, drained the basin, and dried her hands on her apron. "Breakfast is at 6, she said. "Do not be late. Clement eats what is on the table regardless of who has arrived." He had been awake at 5, which was his habit, and he spent the hour before breakfast doing a systematic survey of the property that any experienced hand would have found unnecessary, but that gave him a clear picture of what needed doing. The north fence repair was only the beginning. The barn needed a new weather vane, and 2 boards in the loft floor were soft underfoot. The chicken coop had a gap in the wire that was an invitation to foxes. The well cover had warped and no longer sat flush. The garden had been carefully tended. That much was clear. But the irrigation channel that brought water from the creek to the kitchen garden had silted up at one end and was running at reduced capacity. He made a list in his head, which was how he had always organized information, and he was standing at the pump when Maude came out the back door at 10 minutes to 6 and found him already at work clearing the irrigation channel with a spade he had found in the barn. She stood on the porch and looked at him for a moment. "You found the spade," she said. "It was hanging by the barn door," he said. "I hope that is all right." "Of course it is all right." She came down the steps and walked to the edge of the channel and looked at the work he had done. "I have been meaning to do this for a month. The kitchen garden is suffering for it. It is almost clear. I can finish after breakfast." She looked at him with that steady measuring gaze again. "Come inside," she said. "You have earned your breakfast." That was how the first week went. He worked from before sunrise until the light failed, and he did it methodically and without instruction, moving from one task to the next as logic dictated, asking Maude's preference when there were choices to be made, otherwise simply making the right decision and carrying it out. He was not a man who needed to be told what to do, which Maude noticed, and he was not a man who felt the need to talk about what he was doing or how well he was doing it, which she noticed more. Clement Wilcox watched all of this from various vantage points around the property, offering corrections that were approximately 70% wrong and 30% genuinely useful, and Arthur accepted both kinds with equal equanimity, which eventually earned him something like the old man's approval, expressed in the form of slightly more accurate criticism. The two boarders came and went. Amos Purdy finished his survey and rode west toward Dodge City. Frank Delacroix was replaced by a schoolteacher named Harriet Moss, who was thin and energetic and had a great deal to say about the state of education in western Kansas. A traveling minister named Beaumont passed through for 2 nights and left behind a Bible and an interesting theory about the moral significance of cattle. The boarding house had a rhythm, and Arthur fell into it with a naturalness that surprised him. What surprised him more was how much he thought about Maude. Not in the way of a man who had been alone too long and was simply glad of female company, though there was some of that too. He thought about her specifically. The way she moved through her kitchen with that quiet, contained efficiency. The way she handled difficult boarders, which she did with a warmth that was entirely genuine and a firmness that was entirely unapologetic. The way she sat on the porch in the hour before bed, sometimes with a book, and sometimes simply watching the dark fields with an expression he could not read from across the yard, but that seemed to hold both peace and something he recognized as longing. He did not speak about any of this. He had no right to, and no certainty that she felt anything other than the straightforward regard of an employer for a useful employee, and he had made enough mistakes in his life without adding presumption to the list. On the 9th day, something happened that changed things between them faster than any amount of quiet coexistence would have done. It was mid-morning, the sun already muscular and insistent the way Kansas sun was in late August, and Arthur was on the barn roof replacing a section of shingles when he heard raised voices from the road. He came down the ladder and walked to the front gate and found Maude standing at the fence, talking to 2 men on horseback, who did not look like the kind of men who stopped at boarding houses. They were big men, trail-worn, the kind of men Arthur had spent 11 years reading at a glance. The nearer one had a scar along his jaw and wore 2 guns, one on each hip, which was more about display than practicality, and suggested someone who had learned his idea of danger from stories rather than experience. The farther one was quieter, which made him more concerning, a lean man with patient eyes who sat his horse with the stillness of someone accustomed to waiting for the right moment. Arthur came through the gate and stood beside Maude without hurrying, because hurrying in front of men like this was a mistake. "Who are you?" the scarred man said, looking at Arthur. "I work here," Arthur said. "Is there something I can help you with?" We were talking to the woman. "I am still here," Maude said, her voice entirely steady, which he admired. "And I have already told you. My husband passed away 3 years ago. I do not know what deed you are talking about, and I do not know a man named Vickers." The scarred man's jaw tightened. "Mr. Vickers says he bought this land from Robert Wilcox 2 years before Robert Wilcox died, and he has a deed to prove it. He is being generous, offering you a month to vacate." "No such sale took place," Maude said. "My husband and I made every decision about this property together. He would not have sold this land without my knowledge. And even if he had, a sale of this kind would have been recorded at the county land office, which it was not, because I checked those records myself when Mr. Vickers first made this claim 6 months ago." The scarred man looked at his companion, and the companion looked at Arthur with those patient eyes. Arthur looked back at him. He let the silence stretch for a moment, which was a technique he knew well, and then he said, quite quietly, "I am going to tell you something as a courtesy. My name is Arthur McCrae. I used to make my living finding people and bringing them in, and I know most of the sheriffs and marshals between here and the Missouri border. If Mr. Vickers presents a fraudulent deed in the Redemption Creek Land Office, I will personally see to it that it is examined by a federal land agent. And if I find that Mr. Vickers has done this before in other counties, which is how these things usually go, I will make certain representations to the federal marshal's office in Topeka. The patience in the lean man's eyes did not change, but something shifted around it, a slight recalculation. "You are Arthur McCrae," he said. His voice was smooth and measured. "I am." The two men exchanged another look. The scarred one reached up and adjusted his hat and said something about this not being over, which was the kind of thing men said when they were leaving without getting what they came for but did not want to admit it. Then they turned their horses and rode back up the road toward town. Maude stood very still for a moment after they were gone, and then she let out a slow breath that told Arthur exactly how much that exchange had cost her to appear calm through. "You knew who I was," she said. "When you came here, you knew your name carried weight." "I knew it might be useful sometime," he said carefully. "That is not the reason I came." She turned to look at him, and her eyes were bright in a way that might have been relief or might have been something else. "I know that," she said. "I figured that out in the first 3 days." She paused. "Vickers is a land speculator out of Wichita. He has been trying to acquire properties in this area for 2 years. The deed he claims to have is forged. I am almost certain of it, but proving that is another matter." "I can ride into town and talk to Sheriff Crane," Arthur said. "And I can write a letter to the federal land office in Topeka. I have a contact there, a man named Sullivan who has dealt with this kind of fraud before." Maude looked at him steadily. "Why would you do that?" "Because it is right," he said simply. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said with some difficulty, as though the words were ones she was not accustomed to speaking, "I am glad you are here, Arthur McCrae." It was the first time she had used his first name, and the sound of it in her voice did something to him that he did not entirely know how to put into order. He rode into Redemption Creek that afternoon and spent an hour with Sheriff Crane, who already knew about Vickers and his land claims, and had his own suspicions about the deed, but lacked the federal authority to compel an examination of it. Arthur wrote his letter to Sullivan at the federal land office and paid the telegraph operator at the Redemption Creek station to send it immediately, and then he rode back to the Wilcox property as the evening was coming on, the sky going gold and orange behind him over the town. He found Maude in the garden, still working in the fading light, tying up tomato plants that had gotten ahead of themselves in the summer heat. She wore no bonnet, and her hair had come entirely loose by this point, dark and thick around her shoulders, and she did not notice him coming through the gate because she was concentrating on the tomatoes with the focused attention she brought to everything. He stood at the edge of the garden for a moment without speaking. The evening air smelled of turned earth and tomato plants, and the peculiar dry sweetness of Kansas late summer, and Maude moved between the rows with her hands quick and sure, and Arthur McCrae stood watching her and understood, with the sudden clarity of a man who has been thinking around something for days without looking at it directly, that he was falling in love with her. He did not tell her so. He had no business telling her so. He had been here 9 days, and he was a man with a difficult past and no particular future yet assembled. And she was a woman of considerable dignity and good sense, who deserved better than to be pressed by someone who had barely earned his place at her table. So he called out a greeting, and she looked up and pushed her hair back from her face with the back of her wrist, and told him supper would be in an hour, and he went to put soot up for the night. The weeks that followed were among the most uncomplicated Arthur McCrae had ever known, which he was aware was a strange thing to say about a period that included a land fraud dispute, a near confrontation with 2 armed men, and the general difficulty of being a reformed bounty hunter learning to be a farmhand. But there was something in the daily rhythm of the Wilcox property that settled something in him that had been restless for a long time, possibly for 11 years or possibly longer. He worked. He ate. He sat on the porch in the evenings and listened to Clement Wilcox's long stories about his carpentry years, which were actually quite interesting once you got past the technical detail that Clement included, whether or not it was relevant. He talked with Harriet Moss about the education of children in frontier communities and found that he had opinions about it that surprised him. He watched Maude move through her days with that quiet, capable grace, and he helped where help was useful and stayed out of the way when it was not. And gradually, incrementally, she began to talk to him. Not the practical exchanges of employer and employee, though those continued too, but real conversation, the kind that happened in the hour after the boarders went up and before Clement made his way to bed, when the kitchen was quiet and Maude made 2 cups of coffee and set one at the end of the table where Arthur had taken to sitting, and they talked about things that mattered to them. She told him about growing up in Missouri, about a father who had been a school teacher and a mother who could make anything grow. She told him about coming west with Robert Wilcox, who had been Robert Wilcox of Missouri and full of plans, and about how the plains had been different from what either of them expected, harder and more demanding, but also, she said, more honestly itself than any place she had known. She told him that she had loved Robert in the particular way of someone who had been young and hopeful and growing into themselves, alongside another person, and that she had grieved him genuinely, and that the boarding house had been her way of holding the life they had built together. Arthur told her things he had not said out loud before. About his early years, about the war that had taken his father when Arthur was 12 and left a Missouri family trying to reassemble itself from the inside out. About falling into bounty work almost by accident, following a man who owed his uncle money, and discovering that he had a talent for finding people, that he could read landscape and human nature simultaneously in a way that made him effective. About the slow, accumulating weight of 11 years of it, of a life lived always at the edge of something violent, even when the violence itself did not materialize. "Do you miss it?" Maude asked one evening near the end of August. She was mending a shirt by lamplight, and he was at the end of the table with his coffee, and outside the crickets were conducting their endless summer symposium. "I miss feeling certain about what I was doing," he said. "I do not miss the doing of it." She looked up from her mending. "That is an honest answer. You seem to bring those out of me." She smiled at the shirt in her lap. "My father used to say that honest answers are like good bread. Mostly people want them, but they will not always admit it." "Your father sounds like he was a sensible man." He was. He also had a gift for saying things that sounded wise and turned out to be fairly obvious once you thought about them. "I think that is part of what good teaching is." She paused. "Did you ever think about teaching? You are patient with Clement, which is not nothing." "Clement is not as difficult as he pretends to be," Arthur said. "No," she agreed. "He is not. He is lonely. He was close with Robert, and Robert's death took something out of him. He has improved since you arrived. He has someone to correct." Arthur laughed, which was something he did not do often and which, he noticed, always seemed to please Maude slightly, as though she considered it an accomplishment. The response from Sullivan at the Federal Land Office came in the second week of September, riding in on the morning stage with the other mail. Maude brought it to Arthur at the barn where he was repairing the loft floor, and he read it there in the dusty morning light while she waited. Sullivan had heard of Vickers. Vickers had attempted similar claims in Pawnee County and one in Barton County, both times presenting deeds of questionable provenance and withdrawing when pressed by legal scrutiny. Sullivan was sending a land examiner to Redemption Creek within the month, and in the meantime had contacted the state attorney general's office, and Vickers would find the ground shifting under him in ways he had not anticipated. Arthur handed the letter to Maude. She read it, and when she looked up, her eyes were bright again, the way they had been after the men had ridden away from her fence, But this time it was clearly relief, complete and uncomplicated, and she pressed her lips together for a moment as though she were keeping something in. "It is going to be all right," Arthur said. "Yes," she said, "it is." She folded the letter carefully. "Thank you for writing to him, for all of it. You do not need to thank me. I know I do not need to. I want to." She hesitated, and for just a moment something shifted in her careful composure, some door opening briefly behind her eyes. "You have made things considerably easier since you came here, Arthur. I want you to know I see that." He wanted very much to say something in return that was honest and measured and would not push past what she was ready to hear. What he said was, "I am glad to be here. Genuinely." She nodded, and for a moment neither of them said anything, and the barn held the comfortable silence of two people who have learned not to be afraid of it. The federal land examiner arrived in early October, a precise man named Dalt who wore a city suit and asked excellent questions, and spent 3 days in the Redemption Creek land office, going through every recorded transaction involving the properties Vickers was claiming. At the end of those 3 days, he had what he needed, and Vickers was served with papers by a federal marshal who came up from Wichita specifically for the purpose. Vickers contested it briefly and then, faced with the weight of what Sullivan's office had assembled, did not contest it any further. The land was Maude's. It had always been Maude's, but now it was confirmed in a way that could not be revisited, and the relief that settled over the Wilcox property in the days that followed was something Arthur could almost feel in the air. A loosening of tension that had been there so long it had begun to seem like the natural state of things. Clement Wilcox celebrated by criticizing Arthur's fence repair in unprecedented detail, which Arthur now recognized as the old man's highest form of engagement. The evening after the news came through, Maude cooked the best supper Arthur had eaten in years, a roasted chicken with sweet potatoes and apple pie that Harriet Moss declared was worth staying another week for, and she probably would have except that she had a school to get back to. After the boarders went up and Clement went to bed, Maude and Arthur sat at the kitchen table in the lamplight, and Maude poured them both something stronger than coffee, a small amount of whiskey that she produced from a cabinet above the stove with the air of someone who did not do this often, but had decided that tonight qualified. They sat for a while in the easy silence that had become familiar between them, but there was something different about it tonight, a quality of fullness to it, as though the silence were trying to make room for something that needed saying. "I have been thinking," Maude said finally. "About what?" Arthur asked. She looked at her glass. "About what you said. About needing something honest to do. About returning the money and walking away." She paused. "I have been thinking that what you did took a great deal of courage and that most people would not recognize it as courage because it looked like giving something up. But you were not giving something up. You were admitting that the thing you had was not what you needed." Arthur was quiet for a moment. "That is an accurate way to put it. I know what that feels like," she said. "Robert going into those hills was him looking for something I could not give him, and it had nothing to do with me or with my love for him, and it took me a long time to understand that. For a while I thought that if I had been different, or if the life here had been different, he would have stayed close, but he needed to see the view from the top. That was who he was." She looked up at Arthur. "You are not that kind of man." "What kind of man am I?" he asked, and he was aware that the question had more weight in it than he had entirely intended. She met his eyes, and the lamp between them threw warm light across her face and made her eyes very dark and very direct. "You are the kind of man who returns the money and stays," she said. "Who finds the broken fence posts nobody asked him to find and fixes all 4 of them instead of 1. Who writes letters to federal offices on behalf of women he barely knows because it is the right thing to do. Who is patient with a difficult old man because he understands something about grief." She paused. "You are the kind of man who is worth knowing, Arthur McCrae." The moment stretched between them and Arthur set down his glass carefully and he said, "Maude, I want to be honest with you about something." "Please," she said. "I did not come here because I knew what I was looking for. I came because I did not know what else to do. But in the weeks since, I have come to understand something about where I am and why. It is because of you. Not only this place or the work, but you specifically. And I am aware that I have been here a short time and that I am a man with a complicated history and that you have every reason to be cautious, and I am not trying to push past what you are ready for. I just did not want to keep sitting at your table without being honest. Maude looked at him for a long moment. She was very still, the way she was when she was thinking something through carefully, and Arthur waited without trying to add to what he had said, because it was enough and she needed the space to meet it in her own way. "I appreciate honesty," she said finally. "More than most things." Another pause. "I would not be opposed to you continuing to sit at my table, if you understand that I move slowly and that I need time to trust, not because of anything you have done but because of my own nature." "I understand that," he said. "I have nowhere I need to be except here." Something in Maude relaxed, slightly but perceptibly, some last guarded thing setting itself down. She looked at him with an expression that was warm and real, and without the careful overlay she often kept in place, just her, looking at him. "Good," she said quietly. The autumn came down over the Kansas plains with a thoroughness that Arthur had forgotten, having spent too many years riding through it rather than living in it. The trees along Cutter's Creek went gold and then copper and then bare, and the mornings arrived cold and smelling of frost, and the days shortened with a kind of gentle insistence. Arthur put the property to bed for winter the way experienced hands did, sealing gaps and banking heat and putting up feed and winterizing the barn, and Maude put up preserves in quantities that suggested she took the feeding of people seriously as a point of philosophy. The boarders thinned out in October, and by November there was only old Clement and the occasional traveler passing through who needed a bed for a night. Maude did not seem troubled by the slower season. She used it to mend and bake and keep the accounts and read, which she did voraciously when time allowed, working through the small collection of books on the shelf in the parlor, and occasionally trading with Harriet Moss, who sent parcels on the stage now and then. Arthur and Maude fell into a new rhythm in the winter months, one with more talking in it and more time spent in the same room doing different things, which was its own kind of closeness. He read sometimes too, which surprised her. He had read widely and unsystematically, the way a man does when books are occasional and precious, and he had opinions about what he had read that were often unconventional and sometimes very sharp, and Maude discovered that she liked arguing with him about it. Not arguing exactly, discussing. The kind of discussion that goes back and forth and builds something between the people doing it. One evening in November, Harriet Moss sent a letter along with a package of books, and in the letter she mentioned in passing that she had heard from a friend in Abilene that Jesse Plum's wife had delivered a healthy boy, and that Jesse himself had been released early from his sentence due to good behavior, and the intervention of a sympathetic judge who had been moved by the circumstances of the theft. Harriet did not know why she thought Maude would be interested in this, but somehow she thought she might be. Maude read the letter aloud at the kitchen table and then looked at Arthur. "You told him something," she said, "before you left him in that cell. You told him something that helped him." Arthur was quiet for a moment. "I told him to tell the judge the truth, all of it, about the drought and his wife and what he had done before the theft and after. I told him that judges were human beings and that honest men sometimes found mercy in courtrooms if they had the courage to be honest in them." He paused. "I do not know if that is what helped. Maybe it was just the judge." "It helped," Maude said with quiet certainty. She set the letter down. "His boy is alive and he is going home. That is because of you. It is because of a sympathetic judge. And you," she said firmly. He let her win that one without arguing, partly because she was probably right and partly because, when Maude had decided something was true, she had a way of being completely right about it. December arrived with the first serious snow, 2 days of it, steady and wind-driven, and the world contracted to the property and the warm square of the house, and the lamplight that leaked under doors and through windows into the white dark outside. Clement Wilcox's joints bothered him in the cold, and he spent most of his time near the stove. And Arthur brought him books from the parlor shelf without being asked, and sometimes sat with him in the afternoon and played checkers, at which Clement cheated in ways that were entirely transparent and deeply satisfying to him. Arthur had taken to spending his evenings in the house rather than above the barn, which had begun as a practical matter during the cold snap, and had become, by mutual unspoken agreement, simply how things were. He took the chair by the window in the parlor when there were no boarders, and Maude took the chair near the lamp, and Clement fell asleep in the third chair between them with reliable punctuality at 8 o'clock. And Arthur and Maude talked or read or sat in the particular comfortable quiet of two people who have learned to share a space without requiring it to be filled. On a Thursday evening in late December, a week before Christmas by the calendar, Maude was reading and Arthur was watching the snow that had started again outside the window, and he became aware that she had stopped reading and was looking at him. He turned from the window. She was looking at him with an expression he had not seen before, something open and decisive, and a little afraid in a way that made her look younger and more vulnerable than her usual composed self. "I need to tell you something," she said. He waited. "I am not a person who says things before I am sure of them," she said. "I have spent a long time being sure before I speak, and mostly that has served me well. But I have been thinking about what you said in October about being honest, and I think you deserve the same." "Maude," he said quietly. "I have feelings for you," she said, in the direct, clear way of a woman who has made a decision and is carrying it through with full commitment. "I have had them for some weeks, and I have examined them carefully because that is my nature, and I wanted to be certain they were real and not simply gratitude or convenience. They are real. I wanted you to know." The snow continued outside the window. Clement Wilcox breathed deeply and evenly in his chair. The lamp threw its warm circle around the room. Arthur McCrae set aside whatever he had been doing with his hands and looked at Maude Wilcox across the parlor, and what he felt in that moment was something so large and uncomplicated that it took him a moment to recognize it as happiness. "I have feelings for you too," he said, "as I think I have made fairly clear." "You have been clear," she agreed. "I just needed to catch up." He got up from his chair and crossed the room and sat in the empty chair beside hers, which was the one Clement usually occupied, but Clement was very soundly asleep and unlikely to object, and he took her hand in both of his, gently and without presumption, and she let him. And for a moment they simply sat together in the lamplight with the snow falling outside, and it was enough and it was everything. "I would like to court you properly," Arthur said, "if you are willing, with full honesty about my intentions, which are serious." Maude looked at their joined hands. "I think I would like that," she said. "Good," he said. She looked up at him. "Arthur." "Yes, you may call me Maude," he smiled. "I have been calling you Maude for weeks." "Yes, but now I am telling you that you may." He laughed, quiet and genuine, and she laughed too, and the sound of it filled the parlor and maybe went a little further than that, out into the snowy dark where it dissolved into the enormous Kansas night. Clement Wilcox went right on sleeping, which was just as well. The winter deepened, and the courtship progressed in the measured, attentive way that suited both of them. Arthur brought Maude wildflowers in February when they appeared in the sheltered south-facing patches of the property, which surprised her because she had not known he noticed where those patches were. She read to him on evenings when his eyes were tired from close work, and she had a reading voice that was warm and expressive and made even indifferent prose worth hearing. He learned what kind of mornings she needed quiet and what kind she needed conversation, and she learned that the moments when he went very still and said little were not withdrawal but the form his thinking took, and she stopped interpreting them as distance. They rode out together on clear winter Sundays, nothing unusual about two people from the same property taking a ride, but there was something about it that both of them understood as deliberate, as chosen. They rode along Cutter's Creek, where the ice was forming at the edges, and the cottonwood skeleton stood bone-white against the gray sky, and they talked or did not talk, and the horses went companionably side by side, and the cold air was clean and enormous around them. In March, Arthur McCrae asked Maude Wilcox to marry him. He did it simply, without a great theatrical production, because she was not a woman who wanted theatrical productions, and he was not a man inclined to provide them. He asked her in the kitchen on a morning when the first real warmth of spring was coming through the window and the smell of coffee was in the air, and he asked her directly and without preamble, and told her that he loved her and that he wanted to make a life with her on this property, and be the kind of man she deserved to have beside her for the rest of their days. Maude looked at him across the kitchen for a long moment, and then she said yes. She said it simply and without drama, which was her way, and then she said it again with a smile that broke wide open across her face, warm and genuine and completely unguarded, the most open he had ever seen her. And Arthur crossed the kitchen and took her hands, and they stood together in the morning light, and the long, complicated, difficult paths that had brought them each to this kitchen on this morning dissolved behind them into something that was no longer a barrier but simply a story. The story of how they had found their way here. Clement Wilcox, who had been on the back porch and was under no obligation to be listening, came through the door at this exact moment and observed the scene with the expression of a man who has been waiting for something and is gratified to see it arrive at last. "About time," he said, and went to pour himself coffee. They were married in May of 1883 at the Redemption Creek Church, a small ceremony with Harriet Moss as Maude's witness and Sheriff Crane as Arthur's, which, given their respective histories, struck both of them as wonderfully fitting. The Reverend Beaumont, who had made a return trip through town on what he cheerfully described as divine timing, performed the ceremony with evident pleasure. The whole of Redemption Creek seemed to find some reason to be near the church that afternoon, and afterward there was a gathering on the boarding house property with food, and a fiddle player from down the creek, and the particular kind of happiness that comes from a community recognizing that something good has happened and deciding to celebrate it. Clement Wilcox danced with Harriet Moss for 2 songs, and was persuaded to stop only when Harriet pointed out that his knees were not what they had been, a medical observation he disputed vigorously but ultimately accepted. Arthur and Maude danced together in the evening air, the fiddle carrying them through the last of the light, and she rested her head against his shoulder, and he held her carefully, as though she were something precious that he intended to keep, and the fields around them held the deep green of May, and the sky above was going to the particular lavender of a Kansas spring evening, and the people around them laughed and talked and ate Maude's cooking with the enthusiasm it deserved. Happy? He asked her, though he already knew. Completely, she said. That summer they fell into the life of the property together, which was different from running it alongside each other. There was a new ease in it, a sense of shared ownership that went deeper than the legal fact of their marriage. Arthur took on more of the exterior work and the business of supplies and relationships with the other ranchers in the county, and Maude continued to run the boarding house and the accounts and the kitchen with her characteristic competence, and they talked about everything the way they had learned to that winter in the parlor, with honesty and curiosity and the willingness to be surprised by each other. Clement Wilcox had a difficult spell in July, a bout of illness that kept him to his bed for 2 weeks and frightened all of them, including Clement himself, though he expressed this primarily through irritability and extremely detailed criticism of the way Arthur arranged his bedside table. He recovered, slowly and stubbornly, and with a satisfaction in the recovery that bordered on triumphant, and when he was back in his rocking chair on the porch correcting things that did not need correcting, Arthur and Maude exchanged a look across the yard that contained equal measures of relief and affection. In the autumn of 1883, Maude told Arthur that she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen in the evening, at the table where so much of what mattered between them had first been said. Arthur was very still for a moment in the way that meant he was absorbing something significant, and then the stillness broke into something warm and full and slightly overwhelmed, and he got up from his chair and came around the table and pulled her to him carefully, the way he did everything with her, as though he knew the value of what he held. "A child," he said, against her hair. "In the spring," she said. "April, I think." He held her for a long time without saying anything else, which was exactly right. Clement Wilcox received the news the next morning at breakfast, and was silent for an unprecedented 30 seconds before announcing that he expected the child to be a boy, and that he intended to teach him carpentry regardless of the quality of his fine motor skills, and that he also intended to still be alive in April to be present for the occasion, and that anyone who doubted his determination on this point did not know Clement Wilcox. The baby was born on a clear April morning in 1884, assisted by a midwife named Clara Banks, who traveled out from Redemption Creek, and who had delivered what she estimated was close to 300 children in her career, and who approached the whole business with the calm efficiency of long expertise. The baby was a boy, exactly as Clement had declared he would be, and he arrived in the world with a full set of opinions about the experience, and expressed them at considerable volume. Arthur McCrae sat on the edge of the bed where Maude lay with their son in the white morning light, and he held the baby with the careful astonishment of a man receiving something he had not entirely believed he deserved, and Maude watched Arthur's face as he looked at their son, and what she saw there was everything she had hoped for and more. "What do we call him?" Arthur asked. "I thought Robert," Maude said. She met Arthur's eyes when he looked up, not to hold on to the past, but because Robert brought me here to this land and this life, and it seems right to honor that. Arthur was quiet for a moment, looking at his wife, and what he felt was not complicated. "Robert McCrae," he said. "That is a good name." "It is," she agreed. Clement Wilcox met his grandson with an expression of tremendous proprietary pride, as though the existence of a healthy McCrae boy was something he had personally engineered. He held the baby with surprising competence, which reminded everyone that he had held Robert Wilcox as an infant and various other grandchildren along the way before the family had scattered, and he spoke to young Robert with a low, steady voice that quieted him immediately, the particular frequency of a grandfather's voice working its ancient magic. "He has good hands," Clement said, examining the baby's fists. "He will be capable." Arthur looked at Maude over Clement's head. Maude looked back at Arthur with a smile that was private and warm and entirely his, and the kitchen was full of morning light, and the sound of their son making small sounds of investigation, and the spring outside the windows was coming into itself with the full, particular beauty of a Kansas spring, green and gold and enormous and honest. The years passed in the way that good years do, which is quickly, and with a richness that you notice best in retrospect. The boarding house continued to thrive. Maude's reputation as a cook and a fair-minded hostess brought people out of their way to stay there, and Arthur's steady management of the property and his growing reputation as a reliable and trustworthy man in the community meant that the Wilcox boarding house, as it continued to be known, and as Maude insisted on keeping it because it was the name Robert had put on the sign, and she saw no reason to change it, became one of the most respected establishments in that part of Kansas. Arthur found that he had more to offer this community than strong hands and a fixed fence. He helped mediate a dispute between two neighboring ranchers over water rights, drawing on a capacity for patient, fair-minded analysis that had once served him in tracking men, and now served him in helping men understand each other. He wrote letters on behalf of several families in the area who were dealing with similar land claim issues to the one that Vickers had attempted with Maude, and in doing so corresponded regularly with Sullivan at the Federal Land Office, who eventually wrote that Arthur might consider formal employment with his office, an offer Arthur declined politely with the explanation that he had found his work Sheriff Crane stopped by the Wilcox property occasionally, partly on official business and partly because Maude fed him well. And on these visits he and Arthur would sometimes sit on the porch and have a pipe and talk about the county and the way it was changing, the railroad coming closer every year, the homesteaders filling in the last of the open quarter sections, the slow transformation of the territory from wild land to something with clearer edges and more people in it. "Do you miss the old life?" Crane asked him once, on a warm evening in the summer of 1885, with young Robert toddling around the yard under the general supervision of Clement Wilcox, who claimed to be watching him but was mostly watching a bird in the garden. Arthur considered it honestly. "I miss the certainty of it sometimes," he said. "The simplicity of knowing exactly what you were supposed to do in a given situation. This is more complicated." He paused. "But complicated and good are not mutually exclusive." Crane nodded and smoked and watched Robert fall down in the grass and get back up without complaint and continue on his original trajectory. "Good-looking boy," he said. "He is," Arthur said with the quiet pride of a man who still cannot quite believe his luck. "Named for the first husband," Crane said. He said it neutrally, not as a judgment. "Named for the man who brought his mother here," Arthur said. "Which is what Maude intended and what I agree with." Crane nodded. "She is a wise woman, Maude McCrae." "She is," Arthur said, "the wisest I have known." Clement Wilcox passed away in the November of 1886, quietly in his sleep, at the age of 76, which even he would have admitted was a fair innings given everything his joints had put him through. He left behind a property well served by 40 years of carpentry expertise, a grandson who had already shown a pronounced interest in wooden objects and how they went together, and a gap in the Wilcox household that was particular and irreplaceable, and felt most acutely in the evenings when his chair by the stove sat empty and nobody was telling anyone that their fence posts were too shallow. Maude grieved him honestly and quietly and talked to Arthur about him in the evenings, about the years she had spent alongside Clement after Robert's death, the stubbornness and the gruffness and the hidden sweetness of him, the way he had made the boarding house feel like a family endeavor rather than a lonely widow's necessity. Arthur listened and said the right things and said the wrong things occasionally, and Maude corrected him gently, and they got through it together, which was how they had learned to get through most things. In the spring of 1887, Maude told Arthur there was a second child coming. This one arrived in October, a girl this time, healthy and loud, and possessed of an impressive amount of dark hair exactly like her mother's. They named her Clara for the midwife who had delivered her brother and who was present again at this birth. And Clara Banks wept slightly when she heard the name, and said that in 30-some years of midwifery she had children named for her exactly twice, and she considered it among the finest things that had happened to her. Young Robert, who was 3 years old by this point, received his sister with the mixture of fascination and suspicion characteristic of the age. He stationed himself near her cradle with proprietorial attention for the first several days, as though uncertain whether she required guarding or observation, and eventually settled into the role of older brother with a seriousness that made Maude press her hand over her mouth to keep from smiling. Arthur watched his children with a quiet, sustained wonder that never quite went away. He had not expected this. He had not, somewhere in the long years of bounty hunting and solitary riding, and nights in rough accommodations, and the accumulated moral weight of work he could no longer justify, allowed himself to expect anything like this. He had returned the money and walked away because he could not do otherwise, because something in him had finally said enough, and he had ridden east on an impulse that might have been instinct or might have been something more deliberate than he knew at the time, and he had come through that gate, and here was the result. This kitchen, this woman, these children, this life that was complicated and honest and full and exactly what he needed. He did not say this often, because it was not his way to speak about the large things in long sentences. But one evening in the late autumn of 1887, with young Robert asleep upstairs and baby Clara in the cradle by the stove and Maude at the table with the accounts, the lamp warm between them and the wind coming off the plains with the first cold edge of winter in it, Arthur set down his coffee cup and looked at his wife. "Maude," he said. She looked up from the accounts. "Yes. I need you to know something." She waited, giving him the space she had learned he needed to find the right words. "I have been happy here," he said. "Every day since the first day. I want you to know that. I do not think I say it enough." Maude looked at him across the table, the lamp between them, the wind outside, the sleeping children and the warm kitchen and all of it. 11 years of his other life and 3 years of this one, all of it present in the way she held his gaze. "I know," she said. "I see it in you every day." She paused. "I need you to know something too." "What?" "You are exactly who you said you were when you came here," she said. "A man who needed somewhere honest to be. And you have been honest every day since, with me and with yourself and with everyone here." She set down her pen. "That is not a small thing. That is actually quite a large thing, and I am grateful for it every day." He got up from his chair and came around the table, and she turned in her chair to face him, and he took her face in his hands the way he sometimes did, when words were not the right tool for what needed saying, gently and completely. And he kissed her in the lamplight of their kitchen, and she kissed him back. And outside the wind carried across the Kansas plains the smell of winter coming, clean and cold, and full of the particular promise of the dormant season, the long rest before the next spring. The boarding house went on. New boarders came and went, some briefly and some for longer, and Maude fed them all with the same generous consistency, and sent them on their way knowing they had slept in a clean bed and eaten something made with care, which was, she had always believed, not a small service to offer the world. Arthur continued to be useful in the ways he was useful, which were many, and he continued to be the kind of man who fixed the fence posts nobody asked him to find, which was the core of him and would not change. He sat on the county advisory board for 3 years at the insistence of enough people that he found it difficult to decline, and he lent his name and his judgment to various matters of property and community, and he was respected in the way that people who have nothing to prove are often respected. Harriet Moss came back to visit in the summer of 1888 and spent a week helping Maude with the kitchen garden and arguing with Arthur about books, and being generally wonderful in the way she had always been. And she announced that the school she ran was the finest in the county, and that she intended to teach young Robert McCrae when he was old enough, and that she expected great things from him on the basis of his mother's intelligence and his father's stubbornness, which she delivered as a compliment to both parties. Robert McCrae, at 4 years old, was already showing Clement's gift for carpentry, spending long portions of his days in the barn arranging pieces of wood with a focused seriousness that recalled his great-grandfather so precisely that Maude sometimes had to turn away. Arthur built him a small workbench and found him tools scaled to a child's hands, and Robert used them with a gravity that made Arthur's chest tighten with something he could only call love, the specific and overwhelming love of a father for a child who is becoming themselves. Clara McCrae was loud and quick and interested in everything, a small dark-haired force of nature, who by the time she could walk had identified every breakable thing in the house and developed strong views about the garden, which she treated as a personal kingdom, and which Maude supervised with a mixture of firm guidance and deliberate patience. Jesse Plum wrote a letter in the fall of 1888. He had heard through Sheriff Crane that Arthur McCrae had settled in the area, and he had been meaning to write for some time. He thanked Arthur in simple, honest language for what he had said to him in the jail, for telling him to tell the truth, for the advice that had, in his view, given him his life back. He was managing a small ranch in central Kansas now, his wife and son well, the boy healthy and growing fast. He hoped Arthur was well. He said he thought about the 60 miles from the haystack to Redemption Creek sometimes, and that he was not sure he would have had the courage to be honest with the judge if someone had not told him it was worth trying. Arthur read the letter twice at the kitchen table and then handed it to Maude without comment. She read it and looked at him. "You gave him his life back," she said. "He gave it back to himself," Arthur said. "I just suggested the direction." "That is what good people do," Maude said. "They suggest the direction." He looked at her across the table, in the kitchen that had become the center of his life, with their children making sounds upstairs, and the October light coming through the window, and the smell of something good on the stove. And he thought about the moment in the sheriff's office in Redemption Creek, when he had pushed that money back across the desk and stood up and walked away. He thought about Sheriff Crane's face. He thought about the $750. He thought about Soot carrying him east through the afternoon toward a split cottonwood tree and a white fence and a garden that shamed every other garden in the county. He thought about Maude coming down those porch steps and standing at the gate with her arms at her sides and asking him what had changed. "You suggested the direction," he said, "when you opened that gate." Maude looked at him with the full warmth of 3 years of marriage and the beginning of more years than either of them could count, and she said, "Then we are even." And she smiled that smile of hers, sudden and real and entirely his, and outside the Kansas autumn continued its ancient business of turning the world to gold. In the spring of 1889, when the plains were green again, and the garden was exploding with the accumulated fertility of careful tending across many seasons, Arthur McCrae stood at the fence he had repaired on his first day at the Wilcox property and looked out across the land that was his now in all the ways that mattered, not on a deed necessarily, though the deed was clear enough, but in the way of a man who has built himself into a place so thoroughly that the place would not be what it is without him, and he felt something he had no precise word for, a settled, complete, forward-looking peace. Maude came through the gate behind him and stood beside him, close, her shoulder against his arm. "What are you looking at?" she asked. "Nothing in particular," he said. "Everything." She leaned into him slightly. "Robert wants you to look at the bench he has been building. He thinks one of the joints is wrong, but he cannot figure out why." "It is probably not wrong," Arthur said. "He is precise. He just needs someone to confirm it." "That," Maude said, "is exactly what I told him." "He would not believe me." "He will believe me," Arthur said with a father's certainty. "He will," she agreed. "Go look at the bench, and then come inside. There is something I need to tell you." He looked at her then, at the particular quality of her expression, which was composed in the careful way she used when she was holding something significant until the right moment, and he understood immediately what she was going to tell him. "Maude," he said. "Go look at the bench first," she said, and there was that smile again, the warm, sudden one that still hit him the same way it always had. He looked at Robert's bench. The joint was fine, better than fine. He told Robert so, in specific terms that addressed the construction directly and praised the precision of the measurement. And Robert received this with a nod of satisfaction that was Clement Wilcox to the life, the particular expression of a craftsman who suspected he was right, but needed confirmation before he would allow himself to believe it. Clara attached herself to Arthur's leg on the way back to the house, which she did when she was feeling proprietary, and he carried her the last few steps and set her down on the porch, and she immediately went to investigate whatever Maude was doing in the kitchen, which was another form of inheritance, the need to know what was happening and be part of it. Maude was at the stove, and she turned when Arthur came in, and her expression was open and full and a little luminous, the way it had been when she told him about Robert and the way it had been when she told him about Clara. "Another child," he said. "Another child," she confirmed. He crossed the kitchen to her and put his arms around her from behind, gently, with the full consideration of a man who understands what this costs a woman and what it means. And she put her hands over his, and they stood for a moment in the kitchen that smelled of bread and coffee and spring, in the house they had made real together on the land she had held against all comers, in the life that had begun with a decision to return the money and walk away. He had walked away from 11 years and $750. He had walked toward this. toward Maude and Robert and Clara and the child coming in the new year, toward this kitchen and this fence and this garden and this land, toward the uncomplicated and daily and real work of being someone worth knowing in a place worth staying in. Outside, young Robert McCrae was in the barn with his small tools and his careful hands, building something solid and true. Clara was on the porch describing to the empty yard the complex geopolitical situation of the kitchen garden, which she apparently governed with a firm hand. The spring air came through the open window with the smell of turned earth and new grass, and Cutter's Creek running full in the distance. Maude turned in Arthur's arms and looked up at him, and the love in her eyes was the kind that had been earned and chosen every day since a gate swung shut with a soft click on a September afternoon in 1882. "Happy?" she asked him, which was her version of his question and always would be. "Completely," he said, which was the only true answer there had ever been. And in Redemption Creek, Kansas, in the spring of 1889, that was the whole and honest truth of it.